You know that feeling when important news breaks and you want someone to cut through all the noise.
Hmm.
You want to understand what's really happening without needing like a law degree or something.
Exactly. And that's what we try to do here.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Think of this as your shortcut to being well-informed. We take a set of sources, pull out the key stuff, the essential insights.
Keep it interesting, hopefully.
Yeah, try to.
And today, we've got, well, quite a stack, a bunch of recent executive orders, all from the White House, all dated March 2025.
Right.
So our mission, our deep dive goal today is to really unpack what these orders actually do.
Uh-huh.
Spot anything that feels like propaganda, maybe a bit misleading,
Yeah, the
and
spam.
flag anything that seems, well, maybe blatantly unconstitutional.
And we're also looking at the why behind them, right? The background.
Exactly. Background, funding if it's mentioned, who benefits, who might get hurt.
Moving beyond just the headlines to see the real-world effects.
Okay, so let's dive right in. First one on the list, addressing risks from Perkins Coie LLP, dated March 6th, 2025.
Okay.
So yeah, this one starts off strong. It calls Perkins Coie's activity dishonest and dangerous.
Doesn't pull any punches there.
No, it specifically brings up their connection to the false dossier back in 2016.
Right.
Their work with donors like George Soros on election laws, voter ID stuff, even mentions a court sanction for unethical conduct.
And the race-based hiring quotas too, right? Calling them illegal discrimination.
Yeah, that's in there. So what's the stated reason for this order, the background?
Well, the justification laid out is really rooted in those past controversies. The administration is saying basically that these past actions and the alleged discrimination show a potential risk.
A risk to what?
A risk to national security, a risk in handling sensitive info, and a risk regarding federal funds. The argument is they can't be trusted with government resources or secrets because of this history.
Okay, so it's framing past political fights as current security risks.
Essentially, yes. And it's using that framing to justify some pretty significant actions against the firm. It feels like maybe a new level of using government tools against perceived political opponents.
Right. So let's get specific. What will this EO actually do to Perkins Coie?
Okay, several things. First, immediate steps to review and potentially suspend security clearances for people at the firm.
Suspend clearances?
Yeah, pending a review based on national interest. Second, it tells the OMB Office of Management and Budget to figure out all the government resources Perkins Coie is using.
Like what kind of resources?
Goods, property, services, even access to secure facilities, those SCI facilities. And the agencies are told to stop providing those resources, quote, to the extent permitted by law.
Okay, that sounds like a direct hit on their ability to work with the government. What else?
Government contracts are a big one. Any company contracting with the government has to disclose if they're also doing business with Perkins Coie if it's related to that government contract.
Interesting. Disclosure requirements.
And more than that, it orders a review of all agency contracts with Perkins Coie, or even with companies doing business with Perkins Coie.
A review with what goal?
With the aim of terminating those contracts, again, to the maximum extent permitted by applicable law. It ties this back to an earlier EOO about ending government weaponization. Agencies get 30 days to report back on what they found and what they did.
That could be huge financially for the firm. And it doesn't stop with contracts, does it?
Yeah.
Something about hiring practices.
Correct. It tasks the EEOC chair, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to review large law firms' practices for Title VII compliance.
Looking for what exactly?
Things like discriminatory hiring or promotion, race-based quotas, unequal access for clients, that sort of thing. Then the Attorney General, working with the EEOC and maybe state AGs, is supposed to investigate large law firms doing federal business for race and sex discrimination and, take appropriate action.
So it's really hitting them from multiple angles: clearances, resources, contracts, hiring practices, and there's even stuff about physical access and interactions.
Yeah. Agency heads need to provide guidance limiting Perkins Coie employees' access to federal buildings if it's deemed a security risk or against U.S. interests.
Limiting access.
And limiting government employees from engaging with Perkins Coie folks in their official jobs. Plus, it advises agencies not to hire Perkins Coie employees without a special waiver from the agency head, citing national security.
Wow. Okay, that's a comprehensive set of actions.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about that propaganda angle. The language is very strong. Dishonest, dangerous, false, egregious, undermining democratic elections, blatant race-based discrimination.
Right. It's definitely loaded language, very accusatory.
Is this just rhetoric, or is it deliberately misleading, trying to justify the actions?
Well, it directly links past political stuff, the dossier, the election law work, to these current national security and funding concerns. You could definitely argue it's framing the issue using highly charged terms right from the start.
Kind of setting the stage.
Exactly. Whether it's misleading kind of depends on if you believe those past actions truly represent a current national security threat that justifies these specific sweeping measures. The order presents the allegations almost as proven facts.
Okay. What about constitutionality? Any immediate red flags there? Does this seem blatantly unconstitutional?
There are potential legal challenges for sure. First Amendment issues could come up. Is this retaliation for their political activity and associations?
Makes sense.
Due process, suspending clearances, terminating contracts without, a really clear established process could be challenged under the Fifth Amendment.
Okay.
And maybe equal protection under the 14th Amendment if these actions are based only on past associations or alleged discrimination without proper legal findings, through due process.
But the order does say it should be implemented consistent with applicable law.
It does, which suggests they're aware these legal questions might come up.
So, bottom line, who gets hurt, who benefits? Perkins Coie and its employees are obviously hurt.
Absolutely. Loss of contracts, suspended clearances, hiring limitations. It's a big negative impact on their business and reputation.
And the beneficiaries, according to the order itself.
The order frames it as benefiting the integrity of democratic elections, honest law enforcement, and fair hiring. And of course, it aligns with the current administration's goals.
In funding.
No new funding allocated by this order. It definitely aims to stop the flow of government funds to Perkins Coie.
Okay, let's move on. Next up, we've got two related orders, both from March 6th. Amendments regarding duties and illicit drugs, one for the northern border, one for the southern border.
Right. These amend earlier orders from February that imposed duties, tariffs, essentially, related to drug flows.
But these amendments seem focused on something else.
Yeah, the stated goal here is to minimize disruption to the U.S. auto industry and its workers because their supply chains are so integrated across North America.
Okay, so the northern border one, affecting Canada, what does it actually do?
It exempts goods from Canada that come in duty-free under the USMCA trade deal, specifically things listed under General Note 11 of the tariff schedule from those extra duties imposed by the February order.
So auto parts and stuff can come in without the extra tariff?
Likely yes, if they qualify under USMCA. It also lowers the extra duty on potash that isn't exempt, from 25% down to 10%. These kicked in March 7th.
And the southern border amendment for Mexico? Basically the same.
Exactly the same structure.
Yeah.
Exempts Mexican goods coming in duty-free under USMCA's General Note 11 from the extra duties imposed by the other February order related to the southern border. And again, reduces the extra duty on non-exempt potash from 25% to 10% effective March 7th as well.
Okay, now propaganda or misleading elements. The titles still connect these directly to illicit drugs, but the changes are all about USMCA, auto parts, potash.
Right. It's a potential disconnect.
Is linking these trade adjustments back to the drug issue maybe a bit of spin, keeping a narrative going?
You could argue that. The original orders were framed around drugs, but these amendments are very clearly technical trade adjustments to avoid economic harm, especially to the auto sector. Keeping the illicit drugs language in the title might be, maintaining a political narrative while the practical action is about trade logistics.
And constitutionality. Any issues with the president adjusting tariffs like this?
Generally, no obvious constitutional problems here. Congress has delegated quite a bit of authority to the president on trade and tariffs over the years. These amendments seem to fit within that delegated authority.
So who benefits, who's hurt? Clearly, the U.S. auto industry benefits, as do Canadian and Mexican exporters of those duty-free goods. They avoid the tariffs.
Potash exporters still pay a tariff, but it's lower.
But the link to actually stopping drug flow seems tenuous, at least for these amendments.
Yeah, the direct impact of these specific changes on drug trafficking isn't really addressed in the amendments themselves. The focus is clearly economic. No other specific funding or groups mentioned beyond these industries.
Okay, let's shift to a memo from March 11th. Ensuring the enforcement of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65C. Sounds technical, but the implication seems to be about lawsuits against the government.
That's right. The memo raises concerns about, and these are its terms, activist organizations getting sweeping injunctions against the government.
Injunctions being court orders to stop something, right?
Exactly. The memo claims these injunctions undermine democracy by letting groups interfere with policy through meritless suits, used mainly for fundraising and politics.
And it says taxpayers bear the cost.
Yes, and that DOJ resources get diverted from public safety to fight these suits.
So the focus is this Rule 65C. What does that rule require in simple terms?
Rule 65C basically says that if you want a court to issue a preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order, you usually have to provide some kind of security, like posting a bond.
A bond for what?
To cover the costs and damages the other party, in this case, the government might suffer if it turns out the injunction shouldn't have been issued in the first place, if it was wrongly granted.
Okay. So what does this memo tell agencies to do about Rule 65C?
It sets a policy. The U.S. government will demand that parties seeking injunctions against it post security equal to the government's potential costs and damages if the injunction is later found to be wrong.
So they have to ask for the bond.
Yes. Agency heads, working with the Attorney General, are directed to proactively request this security in all relevant lawsuits where they can show expected monetary damages or costs from the injunction. There's an exception for extraordinary circumstances, but the default is ask for the bond.
And the memo gives advice on how to ask.
Yeah, it tells them to emphasize to the court that Rule 65C mandates security, that their request is based on a reasoned assessment of potential harm, financial costs, damages, and importantly, that if the party doesn't post the security, the court can deny or dissolve the injunction.
The language here also seems pointed. Activist organizations, anti-democratic takeover, meritless suits, frivolous suits. Is this leaning into propaganda territory again?
The language is definitely loaded. It frames the issue as protecting the government and taxpayers from unwarranted, politically motivated lawsuits. Using those terms shapes the perception of the lawsuits and the groups bringing them. It's strong rhetoric supporting the policy.
Could requiring these bonds become unconstitutional in practice?
There's a potential concern, yeah. If the security amounts demanded are set really high, or if it's applied in a way that stops legitimate challenges, especially from smaller groups or individuals without deep pockets.
It could block access to the courts.
Exactly. It could be argued that it infringes the constitutional right to access the courts and seek redress. A Fifth Amendment due process issue, potentially.
So who gets hurt? Who benefits?
The groups frequently suing the government for injunctions could face much higher upfront litigation costs. That might deter some lawsuits, even potentially valid ones.
And the beneficiary.
The government, theoretically, and maybe taxpayers, by deterring suits the administration sees as frivolous and covering costs if injunctions are overturned. The memo mentions these activist organizations get donations, sometimes government grants, but doesn't name names.
All right, let's shift gears. Something maybe less contentious. March 7th, EO, establishing the White House Task Force on the FIFA World Cup 2026.
Right. The U.S. is a host nation for the big soccer tournament in 2026.
What's the reasoning for a whole task force?
The order frames it as a big opportunity, showcase national pride, hospitality, boost the economy, tourism. It calls it the largest sporting event in history, coinciding with the U.S. 250th anniversary. So the task force is for a coordinated government effort to support preparations.
Makes sense for a huge event. What will the task force actually do? Who's on it?
It sets up this White House task force chaired by the president, vice president is vice chair, high level. An executive director will run the day-to-day.
And the members?
Lots of cabinet secretaries, state, treasury, defense, AG, commerce, transportation, homeland security, plus key White House folks, national security advisor, deputy chiefs of staff, FBI director, and others as needed. It's a big interagency group.
Okay, and their job?
Basically, coordinate all the federal agencies involved in planning and executing the events for both the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup and the main 2026 World Cup, making sure everyone works together.
Logistics, security, all that.
Presumably. Agencies have to provide info and help and report on their plans by June 1st, 2025. DHS Homeland Security provides the administrative support and funding, subject to appropriations. The task force sunsets at the end of 2026 unless extended.
Any propaganda here? It seems pretty straightforward.
The framing is very positive, all about pride and economic growth. Maybe downplays potential costs or challenges of hosting such a massive event, but that's fairly typical.
And constitutionality, setting up a task force like this.
No apparent issues there. It's well within the president's executive power to coordinate federal agencies.
So benefits go to the smooth running of the World Cup, potentially host cities, tourism, etc. Anyone hurt?
Hard to see anyone directly hurt by the task force itself. The goal is coordination. Funding comes from DHS appropriations.
Okay. Next one is definitely novel, March 6th. Establishment of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and United States Digital Asset Stockpile. This is big.
Yeah, the U.S. government formally getting into holding cryptocurrency reserves.
What's the rationale given in the order? Why Bitcoin?
It really talks up Bitcoin, calls it the original cryptocurrency, mentions its capped supply, strong security, even calls it digital gold.
Digital gold, strong words.
Very. It argues there's a strategic advantage for the U.S. in being an early adopter of a national Bitcoin reserve because it's scarce. It says the USG already holds a lot of Bitcoin from forfeitures.
Right, from criminal cases and stuff.
Exactly. But there's no policy to manage it strategically as a store of value. So the aim is to harness, not limit, the power of digital assets for our prosperity. It's a pretty surprising embrace of Bitcoin at this level.
Okay, so what will this EO actually do? What gets set up?
It establishes policy to create two things: a strategic Bitcoin reserve, just for Bitcoin, and a U.S. digital asset stockpile for other digital assets.
And who runs these?
The Secretary of the Treasury has to set up offices to administer both. The Bitcoin Reserve gets funded with forfeited Bitcoin already held by Treasury specifically, Bitcoin that isn't needed for other legal requirements like paying victims or operational costs.
And crucially,
The Bitcoin in this reserve cannot be sold. It's meant to be held long-term as a reserve asset. All agencies have to report within 30 days on their authority to transfer their forfeited Bitcoin to this reserve.
okay, and the digital asset stockpile for other cryptos.
Similar idea. It holds other forfeited digital assets, Ether, stablecoins, whatever, again, excluding stuff needed for legal obligations. Agencies also have 30 days to report on transferring these assets. The Treasury Secretary has to figure out how to manage this stockpile responsibly.
Is the government planning to buy more Bitcoin?
The order directs Treasury and Commerce to develop budget-neutral strategies for acquiring more Bitcoin for the reserve, meaning no new taxpayer money. But for the other assets in the stockpile, acquisition is limited to forfeiture and penalties, no proactive buying.
What can they do with these government digital assets?
The order lists several things. Release them to crime victims, use them for law enforcement, share them with state and local partners, satisfy legal requirements.
There's some flexibility there.
Yes. And Treasury has 60 days to evaluate the legal and investment side of all this. Plus, all agencies need to give a full accounting of all digital assets they hold within 30 days.
Okay, propaganda or misleading elements. Calling Bitcoin digital gold seems pretty promotional.
It is strong framing, yeah. And the claim about being among the first nations to do this might need checking against what other countries are doing.
Constitutionality. Any obvious problems setting up government crypto reserves?
It doesn't seem like it on the surface. It's mostly about managing assets the government already legally possesses through forfeiture. And the future acquisition part emphasizes budget neutrality. Seems within executive functions.
Impact. Who benefits? Who's hurt? The U.S. strategic position in digital assets, as the admin sees it, benefits. Provides a framework for managing forfeited crypto.
Right. It's hard to see a specific group being hurt by this directly. The long-term effects of a national Bitcoin reserve are, well, unknown territory. Funding is existing assets, budget neutral for more BTC.
Next is an EO with a very somber title. Honoring Jocelyn Nungare, March 5th. The beginning of this one is quite striking.
It really is. It starts with very strong criticism of the previous administration's immigration policies. Claims they caused suffering led to the border being overrun by dangerous people, resulting in murders of Americans.
And it connects this directly to a specific case.
Yes. Specifically, the tragic murder of 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungare in Houston. It alleges she was killed by two Venezuelan illegal aliens with gang ties who, the order claims, were released into the U.S. by the prior administration. It also mentions her kindness, her love for animals.
Such a tragedy. What action does the EO take in her honor?
It directs the Secretary of the Interior to rename the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge in Texas as the Jocelyn Nungare National Wildlife Refuge.
Rename the whole refuge?
Yes, within 30 days, and ensure her life is permanently commemorated there. Update all federal references, procedures, everything.
Okay, propaganda potential here. The renaming itself is one thing, but the preamble directly blaming a specific murder on past immigration policies.
It definitely politicizes the tragedy. The direct assignment of blame for the murder to the prior administration's policies is a clear political statement woven into the act of commemoration.
So using the honoring gesture to make a political point about immigration.
It certainly appears that way. While honoring her memory is presented, the extensive political framing right at the start uses the tragedy to reinforce a specific policy narrative.
Constitutionality of renaming a wildlife refuge.
No apparent constitutional issue with the renaming itself. That falls within the executive branch's administrative authority.
Impact. Benefits. Harms.
It honors Jocelyn Nungare's memory. It also clearly reinforces the current administration's immigration stance and criticizes past policies.
Right. No specific funding mentioned, likely absorbed by Interior's budget. Hard to say anyone's hurt by the renaming itself, but the political framing is certainly negative towards the prior administration.
Okay. Another one from March 7th. Restoring public service loan forgiveness. Sounds like changes to the PSLF program.
Yes. The order starts by saying PSLF was meant to encourage public service, but then it heavily criticizes the prior administration for, quote, abusing the program through waivers.
Abusing how? It accuses the prior administration of misdirecting taxpayer money via PSLF to activist organizations involved in allegedly harmful activities, specifically calls out illegal immigration and human smuggling.
Wow, strong claims.
Very. It also argues the program creates bad incentives, raises tuition, loads students with debt, and subsidizes wrongdoing by groups hiding under nonprofit status. So the new policy is people working for organizations with a substantial illegal purpose shouldn't get PSLF.
Substantial illegal purpose, that sounds key.
Yeah.
What does this EO direct the Secretary of Education to do?
It tells the Secretary of Education, working with Treasury, to propose changes to the PSLF rules. That's 34 CFR 685.219 to exclude organizations engaged in activities with that substantial illegal purpose.
And does it define substantial or illegal purpose?
It gives examples. Aiding or abetting illegal immigration under 8 U.S.C. 1325, supporting terrorism, including cartels designated as FTOs, child abuse, and here the language gets very specific and charged, including chemical and surgical castration or mutilation of children and trafficking minors, linking this to so-called transgender sanctuary states.
Whoa, that's very specific and loaded language.
Extremely. It also lists engaging in a pattern of aiding illegal discrimination or a pattern of violating state tort laws like trespassing or disorderly conduct.
So that language, so-called transgender sanctuary states, the descriptions, definitely feels like potential propaganda or framing.
Highly charged language, yes. It seems designed to provoke a strong negative reaction to certain activities and groups. Calling states so-called transgender sanctuary states is clearly pejorative. Linking PSLF eligibility to these specific controversial activities and calling the prior administration's actions abuse are definite political statements within the order.
And the definition of substantial illegal purpose seems broad.
It does. It could potentially be interpreted quite broadly, maybe subjectively, by whoever's applying the rule.
What about constitutionality? Could targeting organizations like this raise issues?
Potentially, yes. First Amendment, again, if the definition is applied based on an organization's political speech or advocacy, rather than clearly defined, adjudicated illegal acts.
And due process.
Due process concerns could arise from the vagueness. How is substantial illegal purpose determined fairly? Could it be applied arbitrarily or discriminatorily without proper protections?
So who gets hurt by these proposed changes? Who benefits?
Employees of organizations deemed to have a substantial illegal purpose would lose PSLF eligibility. Depending on how it's interpreted, that could affect a lot of nonprofit workers.
And the stated beneficiaries.
Taxpayers, supposedly by preventing misuse of funds, and the security and stability of the United States by denying benefits to people linked to these listed activities. PSLF itself is taxpayer funded.
Okay, nearly there. We have a proclamation from March 9th, U.S. Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day, and an announcement from March 11th about Senate nominations. Briefly on these.
The Hostage Day proclamation is mostly symbolic. Declares March 9th the day, references the law that created it, expresses support for captives, vows to bring them home, highlights releases achieved by the administration, uses strong language against unlawful detention but no new policies enacted.
Standard proclamation stuff. And the nominations.
Just a routine announcement that the president has sent a list of nominees, assistant secretaries, ambassadors, administrators, etc. to the Senate for confirmation. Standard constitutional process.
The choice of nominees reflects priorities, but the announcement itself is just factual.
Exactly. The impact depends on who gets confirmed to what role. No funding info here.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Quite a mix of actions from March 2025. We've seen very targeted orders like against Perkins Coie and the PSLF changes, using, frankly, some really strong language.
Yeah, language that definitely seems intended to persuade or frame the issue in a specific way. Potential propaganda, as you said.
Then broader policy shifts, like adjusting trade duties or setting up this whole Bitcoin reserve framework.
Mm-hmm. And symbolic actions, too, like the wildlife refuge renaming and hostage day proclamation.
And throughout, we've flagged those potential constitutional questions, First Amendment, due process, equal protection, that might come up as these orders are implemented.
Right. And considered who stands to gain specific industries, the government's strategic position, the administration's policy goals, and who might be negatively impacted, targeted firms, employees losing benefits, maybe even access to courts.
It really highlights how these executive actions, even seemingly small ones, can have real consequences and reflect a broader governing philosophy.
Absolutely. You see threads connecting them, showing priorities.
Now, this is just a condensed overview, of course. We definitely encourage listeners to look up the full text of these orders, dig deeper into the analysis out there.
Yeah, there's always more nuance.
So the final thought to leave you with, as you consider all these actions, from targeting specific law firms to creating a Bitcoin reserve, how much do you think the stated goals align with the likely actual outcomes? And what does this snapshot of executive actions tell you about the current administration's priorities and its approach to using executive power? Definitely some food for thought.